I remember the day the envelope arrived, one of those crisp, pale grey Tuesday mornings in early December, when the cold air stings your face the moment you step outside. I was sorting through a stack of mail at the kitchen counter, trying to keep my 6-year-old daughter Lily from seeing the overdue notices and other bills. My heart always sank a little when I spotted official-looking letters, but that morning a chill ran deeper than usual. There it was, Margaret's handwriting, sharp, angular, impossible to miss. Even before I tore the envelope open, I could feel something in my stomach twist. I recognized that handwriting from countless notes she'd left me over the years. Sticky notes about how I forgot to wash the last dish in the sink. Passive-aggressive messages pinned to the fridge, suggesting that Lily should be wearing warmer clothes. Comments about my irresponsible job choices. Margaret was my mother-in-law, and we'd never had what anyone would call a warm relationship. But this was different. She'd never before sent me anything so official. Inside the envelope was a letter, typed on heavy paper, with the legal jargon that made my eyes blur as I tried to read. Words like custody, grandparents' rights, and negligence jumped out at me, each one slicing through the thin veneer of calm I'd been trying to maintain for months. My hands trembled so much that Lily, who was sitting at the kitchen table drawing one of her endless rainbows, looked up and asked, "Mommy, are you okay?" I forced a smile. "I'm fine, sweetie," I told her. Tucking the letter behind my back and hoping she wouldn't see how my face had gone pale, Lily just smiled back, oblivious to the terror brewing in my chest. James, my husband, was at work. Again, he had picked up so many extra shifts lately that sometimes we only saw each other in fleeting moments. A few kisses at the door, a tired greeting before he collapsed into bed. I was carrying the weight of day-to-day parenting by myself. And as much as I loved being there for Lily and our 3-year-old son Max, I was exhausted in a way that coffee or a quick nap couldn't fix. My first instinct was to call Kathy, my best friend. She answered on the second ring, and the moment I heard her voice, all my composure cracked. "She can't do this," I whispered, as tears stung my eyes. "She's threatening me, Kathy. She's threatening to take my children." Kathy's reply was immediate and steady, like a pillar I could lean on. "Come to the chapel. Right now." She didn't say more. She didn't have to. Kathy knew me well enough to understand that if I was left alone, I'd spiral into anxiety. So I bundled Lily and Max into their coats and rushed them to a friend's house for a quick babysitting favor. I don't even remember half of what I told that friend. Just that it was an emergency. That I'd be back soon. Then I drove with shaky hands across town to a small stone chapel where Kathy volunteered. It was a place I'd often visited for quick, private prayers or just to breathe in the quiet. I found Kathy inside, lighting a candle. The stained glass windows cast warm patches of color across the pews. She looked at me, took one glance at the letter I clutched in my hand, and hugged me so fiercely I almost burst into tears. We sat down in the front pew, and I finally managed to read the letter aloud. Hearing the words out loud made them feel real in a way that sent electric shocks of panic through me. Margaret was claiming I was an unfit mother, accusing me of negligence and demanding sole custody of Lily and Max. She was threatening to drag me to court, to stand before a judge and lay bare all my so-called failings. "Anna," Kathy said, her voice gentle but firm. I know this seems impossible right now, but you have to fight. You can't let her take your children without a battle." I heard that word, fight, and something inside me bristled. Margaret had always fought dirty, with pointed comments and unwavering confidence in her own righteousness. Did I even have the strength to go toe-to-toe with her in a custody war? But at the same time, just the thought of losing Lily and Max made me feel like my heart had been ripped out of my chest. I would do anything, face anything, to keep them safe. Kathy reached for her phone and read me a passage from Psalm 91, one of her favorites. "He who dwells in the shelter of the Most High will rest in the shadow of the Almighty." Read it, Anna. Let it sink into your bones. It's going to be your armor. I'd never really been one to rely on religious verses as a shield before. Sure, I believed in God, most of the time. But as my life became more chaotic, faith often felt like an afterthought. Still, Kathy's conviction gave me a small spark of hope. If Margaret was going to drag me through the mud, maybe I needed something bigger than myself to hold on to. I stayed in that pew for a long time, reciting Psalm 91 in a trembling whisper. When I finished, I felt not better exactly, but steadier, like I'd planted my feet on solid ground after treading water for too long. That night, after the kids were in bed, I sat alone at the kitchen table and stared at the letter. My mind played back every single moment Margaret had questioned my choices. From the outfit I dressed Lily in on a chilly day, to the time I forgot to send Max's favorite toy for nap time, to the many instances I'd snapped at the kids after a long day of work and house chores. I heard the front door open around 10. James trudged in, shoulders slumped, face lined with exhaustion. He paused when he saw me, then frowned. "Anna, is everything okay?" Wordlessly, I handed him the letter. I watched his face transform from tired confusion to utter shock, then to anger. "She can't do this," he said, echoing the exact words I'd used earlier with Kathy. He ran a hand through his hair. "I'll talk to her. I'll put a stop to this." But I knew Margaret well enough to sense she wouldn't back down easily. Not now that she put her threats in writing. Despite her flaws, she was intelligent and unwavering once she latched onto a belief. And if she believed the kids were better off with her, God help us. Sleep eluded me that night. I pulled Lily's tiny sweater out of the laundry basket and pressed it to my face, inhaling the faint scent of strawberry shampoo. I felt tears spill onto my cheeks, unstoppable, as I thought of losing her sweet smile, her morning cuddles, or Max's goofy grins when he begged for extra fruit snacks. The very idea of handing them over to Margaret, someone who had never let me forget how she believed I was never good enough, was unthinkable. To calm myself, I opened my phone and read Psalm 91 again. I whispered the words in the darkness of Lily's closet, where I'd tucked myself away so that James wouldn't hear my sobs. Each line about God's protection felt like a faint lifeline. By the time I crawled into bed, I was exhausted from crying, and I drifted into a restless sleep, filled with nightmares about losing my children. I woke up determined to figure out exactly how serious Margaret was. I told James I was going to see her, and he offered to come with me. But I shook my head. "This is between me and her," I said. "I need to know why she's doing this." He hesitated, clearly torn, but I insisted. I had to face her alone if I wanted real answers. Margaret lived in a swanky Manhattan condo a sharp contrast to our modest suburban home. The doorman greeted me politely, though his eyes flicked over me in that way people do when they sense tension or worry. I took the elevator up to her floor, every ding making me jumpy. She greeted me at the door with her usual frosty composure. Margaret was tall and impeccably dressed in a tailored blouse and pencil skirt. Her hair was pulled back in a tight bun that probably took half a bottle of hairspray to maintain. "Anna," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "I suppose you're here about the letter." "Margaret, what is this? Why are you threatening me with a custody battle?" My voice shook a little, but I tried to hold her gaze. She placed her hands on her hips, chin lifted in that imperious way she had. "Because your children, my grandchildren, deserve stability. They deserve a mother who isn't always tired, always working, always snapping at them." She folded her arms across her chest. "And the photos don't help your case." "Photos?" I repeated, my stomach sinking. She left the room momentarily and returned, handing me a glossy print. It was me, sitting on a bench at the park with Lily and Max in the background, a half-empty wine cooler in my hand. The angle made it look like I was more interested in drinking than watching my children. In truth, that day had been my first break in weeks. My friend had offered me a wine cooler. I had a couple of sips, and that was that. Nothing harmful. But in this photo, it looked damning. "One bad day," I muttered, though my throat felt tight. "You're using one lousy moment to paint me as an unfit mother?" She slammed the photo down on the kitchen counter. "Anna, I've watched you for months. You're stretched too thin. James is never around. The kids deserve better." I wanted to scream at her, to rage against the audacity of her claim, but I forced my voice to stay controlled. "You can't just waltz in and decide you're going to take my children." She lifted an eyebrow. "Watch me." I left her condo in a daze, tears threatening to spill at any moment. I barely made it to the sidewalk before my anger erupted, and I let out a strangled sound of frustration. Margaret was serious. She'd put all her chips on the table. The following week I got a call from a law firm, confirming that Margaret's attorney wanted to schedule a meeting. They suggested I bring my own representation, but lawyers were expensive, and I could practically hear our bank account crying at the prospect. James insisted he'd find a way to pay for it if I wanted a lawyer, but I hesitated, torn between fear of going against Margaret's legal team alone and the fear of bankrupting our already shaky finances. In the meantime, I tried to keep a normal routine for Lily and Max. Every day, I packed Lily's backpack, brushed Max's hair, and willed myself to smile at them, like everything was perfectly fine. But the tension at home was thick. James and I began to argue more. My frustration at him for not standing up to his mother. His frustration at me for not trusting him to handle it. We were both overwhelmed. Whenever it felt like I might explode from anxiety, I called Kathy or spent a few minutes reciting Psalm 91. "He is my refuge and my fortress," I would whisper in the bathroom mirror, trying to convince myself it was more than just words. Sometimes it worked. Sometimes it didn't, but it was better than nothing. The day I finally met Margaret's lawyer was like stepping into a lion's den. The Manhattan office was sleek, with polished hardwood floors and abstract art on the walls. Her attorney was a smooth-talking man in a tailored suit, wearing a Rolex that probably cost as much as our yearly mortgage. He greeted me with an insincere smile and offered me coffee. which I declined. My stomach was too knotted to handle anything. He laid out Margaret's stance clearly. She believed the children's emotional and spiritual well-being was at risk in my care. He didn't bother to hide that he planned to use every questionable moment in my recent history to build a case against me. If I fought back, the process could drag on for months, maybe longer. I tried to speak up, to defend myself, but Margaret interjected with that frosty voice I'd come to loathe. "You're always tired, Anna? Always distracted? I've seen you lose your patience with them. James is barely around. You think I don't notice that you're one meltdown away from giving up?" Her words burned. Yes, I was tired. Yes, I got frustrated. Yes, James was often absent, but that didn't mean I didn't love my children with every fibre of my being. "You don't get to judge me," I managed, my voice trembling with both anger and fear. Margaret's eyes narrowed. I did what I had to do with James. Now, I will do what I have to do for Lily and Max. I was shaking so badly that I barely remember leaving that office. I do recall calling Kathy as soon as I stepped outside. I could hardly speak. I just sobbed into the phone. She talked me down, reminded me to breathe, told me we'd figure something out. But that night, as I lay on the floor of Lily's closet again, I felt more alone than ever. The letter might have been the initial blow, but every day since had felt like a relentless assault on my ability to stand firm. It was in that dark moment that I thought of an image I'd seen in Margaret's home long ago. A small decorative plaque that read, "God protects us, even when people fail us." It was a memory from years back, when James was a toddler, and Margaret was teaching him to pray after his father left. For a second, I felt a flicker of empathy for her. She'd been abandoned too, raising James on her own. She knew about fear and desperation. Maybe that was what drove her now. She saw in me the reflection of her own past struggles. But instead of offering help or compassion, she was choosing control. She was projecting her fears onto my family. Anger still simmered beneath my empathy, though, and it boiled over one afternoon when I showed up at Margaret's place unannounced. I burst in, ignoring her protests, clutching the legal letter in my hand. "You want to take my kids?" I demanded. "Fine. Then let's talk about how you raised James." She was holding a framed photo of James as a boy. She looked startled, almost vulnerable. I stepped forward, anger fueling my words. "James told me about the nights you locked him in his room when he cried. He told me how you hid pills, how you wouldn't talk to him for days when you were depressed. You think you're fit to raise my kids?" Her composure cracked. I could see it in the tremor of her lips and the slight widening of her eyes. "I did what I had to," she snapped, but her voice wavered. "You have no idea what it was like to raise a child alone. And you have no idea what it's like to try to hold a marriage together when you're drowning in guilt," I fired back. "James works non-stop because we're behind on bills. I'm exhausted from trying to do everything, but I'm trying. Every day I'm trying." For a brief second, there was silence between us, heavy with unspoken pain. I saw real hurt in her eyes, and maybe she saw something similar in mine. Then she turned away, clamming up again, that old stubborn pride locking her face in an icy mask. "You should leave," she said quietly. The court hearing was set for December 17th, just 3 days before Christmas. The irony of that date wasn't lost on me. There was a chance I could lose my children right before what was supposed to be the season of hope and joy. In the days leading up to the hearing, I spent a lot of time in the chapel with Kathy. Sometimes I just sat there, tears slipping silently down my cheeks, while Kathy held my hand. Sometimes I prayed with fierce desperation, reciting Psalm 91 over and over, clinging to the idea that maybe God was bigger than all of Margaret's threats. James was mostly silent, torn between his loyalty to me and his complicated feelings toward his mother. We tiptoed around the conversation at home, afraid that one more fight might shatter our already fragile marriage. But the night before the hearing, James placed his hand on my shoulder as I was folding laundry. "I wrote something," he said, voice soft. "It's a letter to my mother, pleading for her to reconsider." I took the pages he offered me. Reading his words made me choke up. He poured out his regrets, his fears, his desire for reconciliation within our family. He wrote about how he wanted Lily and Max to know their grandmother, but not at the cost of tearing our family apart. I cried when I finished reading it. "Thank you," I whispered, tucking the letter into a manila folder. I didn't know if it would help, but it felt like a piece of hope, something that might crack Margaret's armor. On December 17th, I walked into the courthouse alone. No attorney by my side, just that manila folder clutched in my arms. Margaret stood across the lobby, dressed in black, her lawyer hovering protectively at her elbow. My heart thumped so loudly, I wondered if everyone could hear it. I sat at the respondent's table, my palms sweaty, my thoughts swirling. When the judge asked if I was ready, I stood up, the manila folder trembling in my hands. "Your Honor," I said in a voice I barely recognized as my own, "I'd like you to look at these documents before we proceed." I approached the bench and handed the folder over. Inside, I'd placed James's letter, along with photos of Lily and Max in my arms, evidence of happiness and love. And I'd also included something else. A page from Margaret's diary, dated 1995, the year James was 7. He'd found it in an old box in her attic, a single page that read, in Margaret's own handwriting, unfailing him, "God forgive me." It was raw, heartbreaking, a testament to her own sense of inadequacy back then. I knew it might hurt her that I'd found it and used it. But I also believed it might remind her that none of us are perfect parents. We all have moments when we feel like we're failing. The judge skimmed the pages, expression neutral but thoughtful. I glanced at Margaret, whose face had gone pale. She recognized the diary entry. I saw her lips tighten, her eyes glimmer with shock and something else, maybe shame. I took a shaky breath and turned to face her. "I won't fight you," I said quietly, my voice echoing in the silent courtroom. "If you want to take my children, you have the money, the resources, and probably enough evidence to make me look bad. But fighting you, fighting dirty, would mean becoming you. And I can't do that, because I love my children more than I hate you." Margaret stared at me, stunned. Her lawyer frowned, flipping through the folder, but I pressed on, ignoring the tears that threatened to fall. "If you take them," I said, meeting her gaze, "you'll spend the rest of your life proving you're nothing like the mother you hate. All these years, you've been fighting your own ghost. You say I'm unfit, but I think you're just afraid you'll fail Lily and Max the same way you feel you failed James. But if you do this, if you tear them away from me, you'll only be proving that fear right. Maybe you couldn't fix the past, but you can choose differently now." Silence. The judge cleared his throat, but no one spoke. Finally, Margaret blinked, and I saw tears gathering in her eyes, though she tried to blink them away. She glanced at her lawyer, then back at me, her hands trembling. Her lawyer tried to recover, turning to the judge to say something about further evidence. But Margaret held up a hand. She stood there, rooted to the spot, eyes locked with mine. For a moment, I thought she might scream, or continue the fight, or do something dramatic. But she just whispered, "Stop." The hearing was suspended. Margaret's lawyer requested a postponement, and the judge, seeing the emotional state of everyone involved, agreed. But as soon as we walked out of the courtroom, Margaret approached me. She looked drained, older, and not at all like the imperious, flawless woman I'd known for so long. I expected her to lash out, but instead she just whispered, "Anna, let's talk." Without lawyers. We found a small side room near the courthouse halls, dusty with old boxes of files. It was cramped and dimly lit, but it was private. We stood there, and she leaned against a shelf, pressing her fingers to her temple. "I never wanted it to come to this," she said. "I was scared. I see James working all the time, barely sleeping. I see you tired and overwhelmed. It reminded me of... She paused, swallowing hard, tears sliding down her cheeks. Me? It reminded me of... me. For the first time, I saw her vulnerability, the decades-old guilt and fear that had hardened her into this cold figure. "I'm not perfect," I said, voice trembling. "Neither is James, but we love our kids, Margaret. We're trying. We don't want to shut you out. But this was too far." She nodded slowly, wiping her eyes. "I know. God, I know." Another long silence. Then, in a voice so quiet I had to strain to hear, she said, "I'm sorry." I let out a ragged sigh, tears stinging my own eyes. "What now?" She shook her head. "I don't know," she admitted. "I don't want to take them away. Maybe I want to be involved. I want to make sure they're okay, that you're okay." It felt like a moment suspended in time, as though we'd both stepped outside our roles of warring mother-in-law and rebellious daughter-in-law, meeting instead as two flawed, frightened mothers who would do anything for their kids. And in that instant, I allowed a tiny seed of hope to grow. A few days passed. The official hearing date came and went without a court battle. Margaret and her lawyer never filed the full motion. For the first time in weeks, I exhaled. Christmas crept closer, and though James and I still had our share of financial worries, we felt a collective relief so profound it was almost dizzying. Then, on Christmas Eve, there was a soft knock on our door. I was in the living room with Lily and Max, helping them set up cookies for Santa. James was working late, but he'd promised to be home before midnight. I opened the door, and there stood Margaret, wearing a long winter coat and holding a small wrapped gift. For a moment, neither of us spoke. Finally, Lily peeked around my legs. "Grandma?" she asked in a puzzled voice. She'd sensed the tension and hadn't seen Margaret since all this started. Margaret knelt down, tears bright in her eyes. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart," she said softly, extending the gift. Lily squealed and rushed into her arms. I watched them embrace, my heart constricting with so many emotions I could hardly name them all. I guided Margaret inside, unsure of the right words. Eventually, she stood to face me, and for once, the old resentment and hostility in her eyes had softened. She cleared her throat. I wanted to say that I understand if you don't want me here, she began. I shook my head. It's Christmas. Stay. Lily and Max have missed you. She nodded, swallowing hard, as the kids tore into the small gift. 2 matching teddy bears. Margaret glanced at me with an almost shy expression. I'd like to see them more, she whispered. But on your terms, Anna. I promise. I nodded slowly, feeling the weight of everything we'd been through, and the uncertainty of the future. We do this my way, I said, echoing the words I'd spoken in my confrontation. I'm their mother, Margaret. That doesn't mean there's no place for you in their lives. But I call the shots. For a moment, she hesitated. Then she lowered her gaze. I respect that, she said quietly. The rest of the evening was oddly peaceful. Lily dragged Margaret to the Christmas tree, proudly showing off her homemade ornaments, while Max toddled around with his new teddy bear. I stood by the fireplace, listening to their laughter, my heart feeling both fragile and full. Every now and then, the weight of what almost happened flashed through my mind. We had come so close to fracturing our family beyond repair. But somehow, by confronting our wounds, we had begun to forge a fragile truce. I recalled all those moments when I repeated Psalm 91, telling myself God was my shelter. In a strange way, Margaret and I were building our own shelter now. Not a perfect house without cracks, but a place held together by a shared love for Lily and Max, and by a mutual understanding that we each carried scars. Later that night, after putting the kids to bed, I lingered in the hallway. Margaret was hovering near the front door, her coat slung over her arm, looking uncertain. I offered her a hesitant smile, and she reached out to gently squeeze my hand. Anna, she began, voice husky with emotion. Thank you for not giving up on family. I bit my lip, feeling tears well up. Merry Christmas, I whispered. She nodded, blinking away tears of her own, and then she left. The house felt quieter, but not in a lonely way. It felt restful, like the hush after a storm. I padded upstairs and peeked in on Lily and Max, both curled up in their beds, breathing softly. A wave of relief and gratitude crashed over me, so strong I had to steady myself against the doorframe. James arrived home soon after, and I filled him in. He was stunned, then visibly moved by the story of his mother's visit. We sat in the living room with the glow of the Christmas tree lights dancing across our faces, talking quietly about the future. Would Margaret truly honor her word? Could we find a way to let her be part of our children's lives without overshadowing us? We didn't know, but for the first time in months, it felt possible. I remembered the final verse of Psalm 91 as I sat there with James, exhaustion catching up with me. With long life, I will satisfy him and show him my salvation. It reminded me that life is a journey. That salvation, hope, doesn't always come in the way you expect or on your timeline. Sometimes it emerges in the broken spaces, when all we can do is cling to faith and take one shaky step at a time. That Christmas morning, Lily and Max awoke with the usual excitement, bounding out of bed to see what Santa had brought. Wrapping paper flew, and shrieks of joy filled the house. James and I exchanged a weary but contented glance, each of us silently thanking whatever grace had gotten us here. Our family was together, still standing despite the cracks. The next few weeks passed with cautious optimism. Margaret came by occasionally, and we kept the visits short and supervised. Each encounter was a test, a chance to see if we could build a new way of relating to each other, one not rooted in hostility or judgment, but in respect and understanding. It wasn't perfect. Sometimes old patterns flared up. Sometimes she made a comment that made me bristle, or I snapped at her when my patience was stretched thin. But every time, we pulled back from the edge, reminding ourselves of what was at stake. I'd catch her watching Lily and Max, with something like longing in her eyes. And I realized how lonely she must have been all those years raising James alone. How the regret from that time might have morphed into fear, making her do desperate things. We never fully talked it all through, but a tentative peace settled around us. Occasionally, I still read Psalm 91 aloud in the quiet moments, as a reminder that safety isn't necessarily a place without trouble. It's a sense of security that comes from faith, from knowing we're not alone. I think Margaret was trying to find that too, in her own way. Sometimes I look around our modest home, with toys scattered across the floor, and an ever-present pile of laundry in the corner, and I feel overwhelmed. But then Lily will run up to me, arms wide, demanding a hug, or Max will giggle with that adorable belly laugh of his, and all the stress falls away for just a moment. James, coming home at odd hours, will wrap me in his arms and mumble that he loves me, that he's sorry for everything, that he's proud of me. In those moments, the cracks in our house don't matter. The love that filters through them does. Looking back on the ordeal, I realize it was never just about Margaret trying to take custody. It was about two women, each scared and hurting, locked in a cycle of blame and misunderstanding. We reached a fragile truce, forged on Christmas Eve of all nights, when the world seems to hold its breath in anticipation of miracles. It still scares me sometimes, knowing how close we came to ripping our family apart. But maybe, in some strange way, this experience opened a door for healing. I like to think that even houses with deep cracks can let in more light because of those flaws. And I like to believe that sometimes the most broken places in us are where God's grace seeps through the strongest. So here we are. I'm not sure what tomorrow holds, or how Margaret and I will navigate the inevitable bumps ahead. But as I watch Lily and Max grow, I'm determined to give them a life that isn't dictated by fear. They will know that their mother and father love them fiercely. They will know that their grandmother cares enough to show up, even if her methods sometimes miss the mark before. They will know that mistakes can be forgiven and hearts can mend if we choose to let in the light instead of locking it out. And me, I've found a kind of shelter in Psalm 91. Not because I believe in a pain-free life. No such thing exists. But because I've learned that real safety is not about a home without any damage. Real safety is about trust, about love, and about the courage to face our flaws head on. We might not be the perfect family, but we're a family that fights for each other, sometimes fighting with each other, but ultimately striving toward reconciliation. A house divided can stand if the people inside it choose to open their hearts to forgiveness and understanding. It's messy, complicated, and often exhausting, but it's also beautiful. When I think of the final line I'd want to share, the one truth that rose from this storm, it's this. Sometimes the safest place isn't a house without cracks, but a heart brave enough to let the light in.